Another fight at UFC 241 that's important is Daniel Cormier taking on Stipe Miocic. I'll pitch to you this one. If he beats Stipe, Brian Campbell, how much closer does Daniel Cormier get to becoming the best heavyweight of all time? And here's why I asked that. He would not have Stipe's record of winning the title and then defending it 3 times. This would only be his second defense, I believe, since winning. Nevertheless, to be as good as he was, take time away from the division, come back, beat the guy who had the 3, then beat him again for the second title defense, I don't know. It puts him pretty close. What would you say?
Yeah, he'd be really damn close, and it would really make us examine what our standards are for this type of conversation, because there's almost 2 conversations in one. There's accomplishments and there's the eye test. Accomplishments, it's probably Stipe. You can argue it's Randy Couture having won it 3 times.
You definitely can't argue it's Randy Couture.
I think
Fedor, you could argue Fedor.
I think you can. He never was in the UFC. Well, okay, but I got it.
I said greatest heavyweight of all time.
You can definitely argue Randy Couture. But there's the eye test factor. And right now, the eye test is still telling me Cain Velasquez is the best heavyweight I've ever seen. Unfortunately, had the back-breaking string of injuries, and we never really found that out. And there's poses an interesting question in there. And right away, when you see DC come back and beat Stipe the intelligent way that he did and didn't go 5 rounds and wrestle him, he knocked him out, and we're suddenly going, damn, what would it have looked like if DC just stayed in heavyweight the whole time? Like, what would he be right now? He would have to be slam dunk the greatest of all time. And then there's that Cain factor in that question. So I ask you this, Luke. Is Daniel Cormier the folk hero? And by the way, I got a chance to be a talking head on his E60 piece on Sunday that Ariel did, and fantastic work by the folks there. Need a little bit more Campbell in it, though, just between you and me.
I didn't watch it.
But here's the deal. Great American folk hero, the career bridesmaid who finally broke through. But did he go down to 205 because he's the best friend ever? And I'm not doing this to call him out, but this is an interesting topic. Or did he go down to 205 because he knew he was never going to beat Cain? That Cain was the equivalent of Cael Sanderson for him in college wrestling and John Jones for him in light heavyweight fighting.
I don't think he did that at all. I think that he was part of a scenario where he had a choice to make. There was one person ahead of him in terms of tenure, that being Cain Velasquez. Cain Velasquez said, this guy can train at this facility. We all know the story. But basically what my argument is I think Cormier looked at this scenario and said, okay, I have a choice to make. I can go somewhere else and I can compete at heavyweight. Or I can stay here and I have to compete in an unnatural division or something like that. Not my, let's say, not my peak division, right? But what I get to do is I get to preserve this harmony. That's what I get to do. I get to learn from the best. I get to train from the best. I get to keep my family here. All the things that I want to do, I have to make that weight class sacrifice, but I don't have to do anything else. You have a hard time convincing me that he ran from Cain Velasquez into the arms of John Jones as this was some kind of a safer scenario for him.
Did you hear those same whispers, though, that Cain would handle him at the gym? I mean, DC says it himself, but you never know.
I've heard a lot of different scenarios. There should be some reason to believe that Cain might handle him, especially early. Cain had a much more of a head start in terms of that. So that wouldn't necessarily be all that surprising, but also it's a bit of a long game here, too. Just because you can beat someone early doesn't mean they don't catch up late.
Let me ask you this. Had Cain in his comeback fight against Ngannou, which went disastrous before it really started, we never really got to know how good Cain was in this comeback. Let's say he had out-wrestled Ngannou for the 3 rounds and won that fight cleanly.
Would 5.
That was a 5-round fight? Was that the
main event?
That
right?
was the main event, okay. Would we be banging the drum right now? Would we be forcing ourselves to bang the drum to have a John Jones-Rashad situation and have them finally fight to declare
Cain and
Cain and DC right now?
Cain and DC.
Because I've almost, we get to this point when we have 2 active guys who have a claim to the GOAT in that specific category, kind of like when Nunez and Cyborg just recently met. You sort of have to see them meet. Because you're asking me, if DC beats Stipe a second time, can you make that case? No, I still have the eye test of what I've seen from Cain. And I'm not saying you necessarily solve that debate by seeing an old broken Cain get in there against DC and sever their friendship, but I'm sort of asking you, would we have been beating that drum right now to say, we need to find out who's the greatest heavyweight in history?
We might be. It would be a different scenario. All I know is that Cormier has smartly played his situation for harmony, for long-term growth, took advantage of heavyweight when it was there. And the other thing I would say is, you ask about the eye test. I don't know. Cormier meets the eye test pretty well for the most part.
He does.
The other part is about accomplishments. Well, yeah, you're not going to have as many accomplishments if you spend a huge chunk of your career not even in that weight class, right? So all the things he could have been doing at heavyweight, because yes, he did get accomplishments at light heavyweight, but let's say he never left. How many accolades would he have at heavyweight? Would it be so overwhelming at this point that we wouldn't be having this discussion? So just by the process of subtraction of time, okay, he doesn't have as many title defenses, but he wasn't even competing in the same space, so of course he can't.
And he manhandled every heavyweight he faced.
Right. It's not like, I mean, the only guy who ever really gave him the tough fights were Jones, obviously, and then Gustafsson.
Yeah.
And he beat Gustafsson, so it's like, I don't know what to tell you all, folks.
What about this, though? You mentioned Fedor before, and that's why I sort of countered you and said maybe this should be a UFC-only discussion. I'm sort of still of the belief that Fedor is separate from this conversation because he is the greatest heavyweight of all time and is at that upper room table with the 5 greatest fighters of all time, regardless of weight.
Yeah, the issue is, I mean, he kind of peaked around 2004. I mean, he had some good moments after that. But
so you're saying time will remove him from the equation the same way that time obviously removed Royce Gracie when the sport evolved and removed Ronda Rousey as well.
I don't think we're near that because he still competed in what is commonly known as the modern era. He had a modern skill set. He wrote the blueprint on modern ground and pound, especially for without elbows. Since then, it's been updated, but some of the early things you could do. So, like, I don't think the eras are so far apart. And as they get further and further apart, the gradients between them get finer. So, like, the difference between Ken Shamrock versus Royce and even Rousey versus Carmouche is enormous. But the difference between Rousey, Carmouche, and Fedor, it's much, and Fedor versus, let's say, Krokop 2004, it's a little bit narrower. Although you could actually argue that those guys were even better, actually. I take that back a little bit. Not the best comparison. Suffice to say is that, look, 2004 MMA is not the same as 2019 MMA. So I think the gradients are finer. I still think that his overall body of work puts him in a position where top 5 all-time fighters, I don't know, but the best heavyweight I've ever seen, probably. I just think Cormier, if he can just stay healthy and keep doing what he's been doing without significant drop-off at 40, which is a big task, it's like, well, maybe that conversation needs to change. Real quickly, last thing on this for Miocic.
I got one more on you.
Make it fast, because we got to move on.
All right, from the idea of legacy, when Cormier, who has never beaten John Jones, moved up to heavyweight and beat Stipe, we all wrote basically the same thing, that this was DC's chance to cut the line and basically reach immortality without having to have beaten Jones, because he won titles in 2 divisions, and you could make cases of the 2 Jones losses. That one they threw out because it's a no contest, and the first, DC also believes Jones was dirty. Whatever, it's a side conversation for another day. So it's almost as if DC entered that upper room, that table of the 5 or 6 best fighters ever. Does he potentially still have a chance to lose that spot, though? Should he, let's say, lose to Stipe, or should he lose to John Jones in a trilogy? Can you lose what you've gained at this point? And I have that same question for Demetrius Johnson, who I thought got to a point where he reached that category. But if he's going to linger in one and do this sort of off American TV, does he also fall out of that category?
It's sort of the BJ Penn conversation in a different way, which is if you've done all this, how sterling is that still after all the stuff that comes after? This is a much more narrower subset of success and failure, or at least certainly the failure side. I would say I'd have to think about it more. I don't know. Here's the only thing I'm certain of is that if he beats Stipe, the claim to best heavyweight of all time gets significantly better because he would have beat the guy who had the most title defenses twice. No questions asked at that point. Last thing, though, what if Miocic changes the script a little bit? What if he comes back and beats Cormier? So you're talking about the Cormier side. Well, hold on. Flip it a little bit, because then you could say, well, I don't know if the first fight was a fluke. I don't think it was a fluke, but...
Then it makes the third fight very important, like historically, legacy.
And that becomes the fight for, at least in the modern era of post-2010, the best heavyweight that we've seen of our lifetime.
I fully agree.
That's what it would be. Interesting.